Roughly 3,200 years ago, the most sophisticated civilization the world had yet produced simply ceased to exist. Not gradually, not across centuries. Within about 50 years, palaces that had stood for 500 years were reduced to cinders. Kings who once ruled vast territories disappeared entirely from the historical record, and an entire web of interlinked trading societies fell apart so thoroughly that the generations who followed lost the ability to write. For decades, one explanation dominated a shadowy wave of seaborne raiders with no flag and no homeland. Egypt called them the Sea Peoples. Then the trail went cold for 3 millennia. Now, DNA pulled from the actual skeletons of the people involved is finally answering a question that had stumped researchers for a century, and the answer isn't what anyone expected. To grasp what was lost, you first need to understand what existed before the fall. By 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was a patchwork of disconnected tribes. It was, in every meaningful sense, humanity's first globalized network Egypt, governed by pharaohs whose armies reached into the Levant, traded grain and gold. The Hittite Empire, dominating most of present-day Turkey, was a military powerhouse that had once fought Egypt to a draw at Kadesh before the two signed one of history's earliest peace treaties. Mycenaean Greece, the palace civilization, later immortalized in Homer, shipped bronze ceramics and olive oil across the Aegean. Cyprus served as the industrial center of the copper trade, and the city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast functioned almost like a stock exchange, where merchants from a dozen nations settled accounts and lived side by side, writing in multiple languages. Bronze was the adhesive that held this entire system together, and bronze demanded both copper and tin, two metals rarely found near one another. That meant every kingdom, every palace, every army in this world was economically bound to every other by trade routes spanning thousands of miles. This wasn't a loose collection of ancient societies. It was a supply chain, and every supply chain, no matter how sophisticated, shares one dangerous weakness, sever enough links, and the whole thing doesn't just weaken. It collapses in one stroke. The devastation begins and doesn't let up. In Greece, the great palace of Pylos, home to a king mentioned in Homer's epics, burns to the ground, its administrative records baked solid by the same fire that consumed it. Mycenae itself, the storied home of Agamemnon, crumbles not long after. In Anatolia, the Hittite capital of Hattusa is abandoned and torched, and with it, one of the two great superpowers of the ancient world vanishes so completely that later, civilizations forgot it had ever existed until 20th century archaeologists unearthed it. On Cyprus, cities are sacked. Then the destruction reaches Ugarit, that legendary trading hub, that ancient financial capital of the Bronze Age. Archaeologists have recovered the final letters from its last king, begging for ships and soldiers that never came, because the very kingdoms he was pleading with were already in flames. Ugarit is destroyed so completely, it has never rebuilt a city that had served as an international commercial center for centuries, wiped away in a single generation, never to return. For a century of modern scholarship, the same answer surfaced repeatedly in ruins on temple walls. In desperate diplomatic correspondence, the Sea Peoples. The most detailed account comes from Egypt, carved into the walls of Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. The inscriptions describe a coalition of seaborne attackers striking Egypt's coast around 1177 BCE, a date so pivotal that one prominent historian named an entire book after it. The reliefs depict something Egypt had never shown before. Whole families riding in ox carts alongside armed fighters wearing horned helmets and feathered headdresses, moving not like a raiding party but like a migration. Ramesses claims to have crushed them in a massive land-and-sea battle, the earliest naval engagement ever recorded in such detail. And the carvings show Egyptian archers picking off enemies from capsizing ships. Here's where it gets grimmer. Egypt survived. Almost no one else did, and the Sea Peoples were never one people at all. Egyptian records list distinct groups within this loose coalition, among them the Peliset, the Shurdan, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Checker, the Luka, and the Weshesh. Some of these names echo forward through history in striking ways. Historians broadly agree the Peliset became the Philistines of the Old Testament, the very people who would later stand against a young shepherd named David. Consider that lineage a group first recorded as terrifying raiders assaulting Ramesses. Third becomes, within a few generations, a settled population in Canaan with its own cities, pottery traditions, and a name that survives today as Palestine. Yet, at the time, nobody in Egypt, Ugarit, or the Hittite court could say where any of these groups actually originated. There was no single homeland, no shared language, no unifying king. Some inscriptions hint at Anatolian ties. Others point toward the Aegean. Still others toward Sardinia and Sicily Islands, whose names, some scholars argue, may derive from two of these very groups, the Shurden and the Shekelesh. For 100 years, that ambiguity was the entire puzzle. Nobody could pin down the Sea Peoples because as a single unified nation, they may never have existed. That uncertainty fed a theory that dominated the field for decades, a mysterious horde emerging from nowhere, single-handedly ends the Bronze Age. It made for a compelling story. But the real explanation, pieced together by archaeologists, climatologists, and geneticists working in tandem, is stranger and far more unsettling. The deeper researchers dug, the clearer it became that the Sea Peoples weren't the cause of the collapse. They were a symptom of forces that had already been tearing the Bronze Age world apart for decades. Historians now describe a tangle of overlapping crises as a systems collapse, a prolonged roughly 3-century megadrought that triggered widespread famine and broke down the trade routes, sustaining the Bronze Age economy. Some researchers have even proposed a devastating chain of earthquakes rippling across the eastern Mediterranean, during these same decades toppling palaces already destabilized by economic strain. Add to that the internal fragility of massive top-heavy palace bureaucracies, so dependent on centralized control that a single failed harvest or blocked trade route could send the entire administrative machine into freefall. This wasn't chaos. It was a system so tightly interconnected and efficient in good times that it had no slack left when multiple shocks landed simultaneously. Into that vacuum of collapsing states, failed crops, and broken trade networks came waves of displaced, desperate people, some fleeing their own crumbling regions, others turning to raiding, because the economic order that once sustained them no longer existed. The Sea Peoples didn't light the fire. Largely, they were people fleeing it, and in fleeing, they helped burn down what remained. For over a century, this stayed an educated theory assembled from broken pottery, charred grain, and Egyptian royal propaganda. What it lacked was the one form of proof no inscription could offer: physical biological evidence of who these people actually were. Ancient texts can lie kings, exaggerate victories, scribes inflate threats to justify wars. DNA has no such agenda. It simply records what happened inside a human body, passed down through inheritance, surviving faintly in bones buried for 3,000 years. This is where the story shifts from archaeology into something closer to forensic investigation. The breakthrough came from Ashkelon, one of the 5 great Philistine cities named in the Bible on Israel's Mediterranean coast. Researchers analyzed genome-wide data from 10 individuals buried at Ashkelon, spanning the transition from the late Bronze Age into the early Iron Age, precisely the window when Philistine culture is thought to have emerged. What's easy to miss is just how precise this evidence turned out to be. The early Iron Age population at Ashkelon proved genetically distinct from the population that preceded it. Carrying a European-related genetic signature absent from the earlier Bronze Age remains at the same site. In plain terms, this moved beyond speculation. It was measurable scientific proof that people carrying ancestry from across the Mediterranean arrived in Canaan at precisely the moment Philistine culture appears in the archaeological and textual record. According to the researchers, this genetic shift aligns with the same Southern European source population that earlier evidence had already suggested, DNA confirming what archaeologists had only been able to infer from pottery and architecture. Here's the more human twist: this wasn't an army storming a beach. Genetic analysis from Philistine burial sites points to families carrying mixed Southern European and local Canaanite ancestry, not a purely foreign warrior class, violently displacing an existing population. And crucially, these were households showing signs of farming life, not military occupation. Compare that to Ugarit, a city obliterated so violently it was never resettled, and a pattern the old narrative completely missed comes into focus. The Sea Peoples weren't a single invading force executing one coordinated campaign across the Mediterranean. In places like Ugarit, the encounter meant total annihilation. In places like Ashkelon, it looked more like displaced populations settling in, intermarrying, and building a hybrid society atop the old one. The same historical event produced both massacre and merger, depending entirely on where you stood. Then comes a twist. Almost nobody discusses the part that turns a tidy origin story into something far more unsettling. If these newcomers truly arrived and settled into Philistine cities carrying new genetic ancestry, you'd expect that ancestry to persist in the bloodline. Conquering settling populations usually leave a lasting genetic mark that geneticists can trace for millennia. But that isn't what happened here. Researchers found that the European-related genetic signal so clearly present in the early Iron Age population was no longer detectable in the later Iron Age population at that same site. Except when geneticists went looking for biological proof, the picture got more complicated. A large-scale genetic study of dozens of ancient individuals from more than 20 archaeological sites across Sardinia, spanning roughly 6,000 years from the Middle Neolithic through the medieval period, turned up something researchers didn't fully anticipate. Sardinia's genetic ancestry stayed remarkably stable all the way through the end of the Nuragic period around 900 BCE, even as mainland Europe absorbed entirely new ancestries during that same Bronze Age window. Here's the detail that should give you pause the rise of Sardinius, iconic Nuragic stone towers. The culture most closely tied to the supposed Shurden homeland doesn't coincide with any detectable new genetic ancestry arriving on the island at all. If the Shurden really were a foreign population sweeping in to found the Nuragic civilization, their arrival should have left a genetic fingerprint. It didn't. This doesn't disprove the Shurden-Sardinia connection, but it does flip the direction of the story. Rather than a foreign people conquering Sardinia and lending it their name, the more likely sequence, according to researchers, is that Sardinian seafarers already settled on the island for centuries, were among those swept into the chaotic raiding coalition during the collapse, some serving as mercenaries in Egyptian and Libyan armies, others turning to raiding once the trade economy that sustained island life broke down. The Shurden weren't outsiders invading Sardinia. They may have been Sardinians who ventured out into a collapsing world, and some of them never fully returned as who they'd been. This reframes the entire picture of who the Sea Peoples were. They weren't one migrating nation with a single point of origin. They were a genuinely mixed coalition, an accidental alliance of displaced Aegean refugees, unemployed Anatolian mercenaries, opportunistic raiders from the central Mediterranean, and famine-fleeing farmers, all drawn together by the same collapsing world, all pushing outward in overlapping waves, because the systems that had once held their home societies together had already failed. Here's the part that turns this from ancient tragedy into something almost architectural in its consequences. Out of this total systems collapse, an entirely new world rises from the wreckage of the centrally administered palace economies of the Bronze Age, where scribes tracked every jar of oil and measure of grain flowing through royal storehouses, simply can't be rebuilt at the same scale. In their place emerges something genuinely new, smaller, more decentralized societies, less top-heavy, more resilient to the kind of single point of failure collapse that had just destroyed the old order iron, once a rare expensive metal used mainly for ceremonial objects because bronze production depended on fragile far-reaching trade routes for tin, suddenly becomes the practical metal of necessity. Iron ore is far more widely available. It doesn't require a Mediterranean-spanning supply chain to forge a working blade. The very collapse that destroyed the old economic order is the same event that pushes humanity into the Iron Age faster and more completely than it might have happened otherwise. The world order that would eventually give rise to classical Greece, to the Iron Age kingdoms of the Near East, to the biblical narratives, still read by billions today, wasn't built. Despite the Bronze Age collapse, it was built directly out of it by the very people the Sea Peoples had set into motion. So where does this leave us 3,000 years later armed with genome sequencers instead of temple inscriptions? The honest answer is that the mystery isn't solved, it's been refined into something more precise and in some ways more unsettling. The old story, at least, had a villain, a mysterious horde from nowhere, defeated by a righteous pharaoh, order restored. The real story, the one DNA is dragging into the light. One skeleton at a time, has no villain at all, just a tightly interconnected world running at the edge of its own capacity, hit by simultaneous shocks of drought, famine, earthquake, and economic collapse, which pushed ordinary displaced people, farmers, refugees, unemployed, mercenaries, entire families, and ox carts into becoming the very force that finished off what those same shocks had already started breaking. The DNA evidence remains remarkably thin. 10 individuals from Ashkelon, a few dozen from Sardinia, a handful of scattered sites across a catastrophe that touched the entire eastern Mediterranean. Every new burial excavated, every new genome sequenced, has the potential to overturn what we think we know all over again, the same way Ashkelon's genetic data quietly upended a century of assumptions about who the Philistines really were. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. The Bronze Age world of 1200 BCE looked in its own way, remarkably like ours, deeply interconnected economically, interdependent across vast distances, confident in its own permanence. Nobody in Ugarit, writing those final desperate letters begging for ships that would never arrive, believed their civilization was about to disappear within a generation. They believed, as every advanced society tends to believe, that the system was too big, too essential, too deeply woven into the world to fail all at once. The DNA in those Bronze Age bones doesn't just tell us who the sea peoples were, it tells us how quickly an interconnected world can unravel when enough pressures hit at once, and how the survivors of that unraveling don't simply vanish. They become someone else's ancestors. So the real question, the science is still chasing, is just who the sea peoples were 3,000 years ago. It's whether we'd even recognize the early tremors of the same kind of collapse if we were living through the opening chapter of one right now,